So we're back with Fieldscaper, and today we're going to take a look at the sequencer in Fieldscaper. This is a feature that was added after I completed my original Fieldscaper tutorial video, but it's a nice addition, so we're going to take a very detailed look at that. Now you might be wondering what sense it makes to have a sequencer in something like Fieldscaper. Fieldscaper, after all, doesn't generate sound. It basically takes a pre-existing sound sample or piece of music, it could be, and it plays it in an analog fashion, by which I mean it plays it essentially end to end and applies all sorts of filters, effects and mangling to the sample. So in some sense it's a bit of a mystery what it means to add a sequencer to that. But in a nutshell, the sequencer allows us to impose some rhythmic structure onto the playback, and it does that in two different ways, which we'll look at in moderate detail in due course. Now one of those ways is it offers us an alternative way to animate the parameters to some, if not to all, of the effects available in Fieldscaper. Now if you're familiar with Fieldscaper, you'll know that most things can be animated using LFOs. So you can apply, let's say, the filter cutoff to the starting value and then have an LFO vary that value up and down. So now we have another way to animate those parameters over time, which is we have a step sequencer, and at each step of the sequence we can modify a single parameter in one of the effects. So we'll see that. Before we get to that, we're just going to set up one thing, or two things actually, in Fieldscaper, just to make the explanation a little bit more coherent. If you direct your attention over to the top right of the screen with the timing area, if you press on there, we'll get a dialog. I want to set beats per minute to 60 beats per minute, which it's already set to. That's at the bottom of this dialog. We've also got, if you just note at the top right, the time signature is set to 4/4. Now these things, generally speaking in Fieldscaper, they're more connected to, I think, to looper mode and to recording your own sounds. It allows you to record those quite precisely in terms of the length, and you can specify the length, or you can express the length in terms of seconds or in terms of beats per minute or in measures. But for now, just recognise we've set to the internal BPM to 60 beats per minute. So how do we get to the sequencer? Now we've got, just a quick refresher, we've got three independent noisemakers or oscillators, sample based oscillators in Fieldscaper. We're only going to focus on one of those pretty much for this demo, but the three oscillators are the three kind of square areas replicated across the bottom of the screen. If I just toggle between 1 and 2, you should see them down there. I'm going to mute oscillator 2 and 3, and we're pretty much not going to look at those for the rest of the video. But if you look at, there's a button labelled SEQ. If you press that, we get this new dialog, and this is where we control the sequencer. Now this is a fairly, well, confusing dialog. It's not very intuitive in some ways, but we have this to work with. I'm going to describe this in three different ways, three different parts. In fact, before I do that, let me just give you a demo of what kind of thing this is set up already with a sequencer attached to this preset. If I play the file that I've got loaded, it's just a bit of guitar. So it's just acoustic guitar that's played completely dry with no effects. If I play it with this sequence in place but with the sequencer deactivated, you'll get to hear what the raw effect. So there's some reverb on there, there's some filtering going on, I think low pass filter. You can see the playhead skipping as well. That's one of the address functions that allows you to chop up the playback. If I just go back in and re-enable the sequencer, there's two different things I'm enabling now. I'll get to that in a minute. And play it again. You should detect that there's now some sort of beat kind of rhythm playing over the top of that, or built into that playback. So that's the sort of thing, effect that we're going to get, or one of the kinds of effects that we're going to get with this sequencer. So if I go back into the sequencer, so the sequencer has got 16 steps. I'm going to set it to default Now there's a button labelled RES, which stands for reset. If I click that, it resets. But coming back to the sequencer itself, we've got 16 steps. I'll just enable all of those as we go. There's a number of different subtleties to this, which you probably won't get until you play around, but I'll try and point them all out. Now then, coming back to that 60 beats per minute, I'm going to say this in very analytical terms. Now, this is really just so you understand what's going on. Once you understand what's going on, you won't really think about it in such analytical terms. You'll just tinker with it till you get a nice sound. So we've got 16 steps, and that covers one bar, or one measure. And because we're in 4/4 time, that's 4 beats. And because we've set it to 60 beats per minute, that's 1 beat per second. So 4 beats takes 4 seconds. So the sequencer's disabled. If I let the sequence run and I mute the sound just so we can see this, you can see that the sequence is animated. There's a sort of step playhead, if you like, that little yellow flash, and that's going through each of the steps in turn, and if you count, you'll recognize it takes 4 seconds to get from the left to the right. Now we do have a little bit further down, we've got some multipliers and dividers which are labeled BPM, and it's currently set to 1 times 1, so it's playing at 60 beats per minute. If I click 2 times 2, it's playing at 120, times 4, 240, back to times 1. If I go straight to a quarter, you can see it's dividing the BPM. So we'll leave that at times 1 for now. The other thing we can do is we can limit the length of that. We may not want 16 steps. We can limit that to, well, whatever we want. If I click on that step there, and if I click the STP button, which is at the top right of this dialog, you'll see that little skinny red line at the bottom of the sequencer has now contracted, and you'll see the sequence wraps round at that's probably the 9th or 10th step. If I go back to, let's say we just want 4 steps, click there, click STP, and so we've got a short step, and then we can have a short step where only the 1st, 3rd and 4th steps play, and so on. We're going to set it to full length again for now. Let's just, before we do this, let's get a sound in there that we can work with. This guitar sound, it's going to be kind of confusing if we want to see precisely what's going on with the sequencer. So if we just record something, I'll record a sort of drone, I'll hum into there. That's me trying to hum in tune. Let's normalise that to make it loud enough. Do that. What's that going to sound like? Let's put the preset to empty, so all we get is a little bit of reverb. It's a very uninspiring sound there. If we run up the sequencer, if I just mute that again, because we've reset the preset to empty, we've lost the changes that we made to the. It'd be nice if you could save the setup of that sequencer screen separately, independently of the loaded preset. I don't think you can do that, which is slightly unfortunate. I'm going to set all the steps back on. So we've got 2 things this sequencer can do to our sound, and broadly speaking they are represented by the top half of the dialogue and the bottom half of the dialogue. The bottom half of the dialogue is the one we're going to look at first, and it's labelled as an envelope generator. You should recognise some of the words on there. We've got an ADSR envelope. Now although this is referred to as an envelope, it's better to think about this as a gate. It's a gate that opens and closes on the playback, and so it essentially enables or disables the sound of the playback, if you like. But because we can apply an envelope to that, we can shape the gate, if you like. It's set by default to attack 0, decay 0, release 0, sustain 100%. So essentially we get a square wave opening and closing, chopping up the sound. So if we enable the and if I click the enable button to enable the envelope, that's the enable button I'm toggling it there, sort of halfway down and to the left, well, a bit more than halfway. And if I unmute, nothing much seems to be happening. We get a glitch when it wraps around. I think that's just my recording. It's got that glitch. So why are we not hearing anything? Well, this is why we have. This is where we need to think a little bit more analytically. This is a 16-step sequencer. We need to specify the length of the steps, which we do with the slider that's pretty much in the middle of the screen. Now, if you think about this, we've got 1 beat per second. What that means, if you think it through arithmetically, if we have the step length set to 1/4 of a second or greater, basically it's not going to interrupt the playback at all. We're just going to get the continuous. So if we look at that slider, which helpfully tells us just above the slider some useful things. It tells us the time signature, this is this slider here, time signature, the beats per minute. I think that I next to BPM means internal. We could have this set up to receive in MIDI externally, in which case that I would be replaced by a number of different codes. And it tells us the length of the step in seconds, so it's 0.25 seconds. So I predict if we slide this down 1 notch, that interruption to the playback should become detectable. Sure enough, we get that, and it's very kind of glitchy because it's a simple square wave. If I just take that down further, it's getting more staccato as we go, and that's as low as we can go. So what we can do now is we can play with the envelope generator and modify that envelope to make it a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. So if I change the attack and then the release, attack first, if I put the attack up, I'm just going to fix this, it's not a very good sample. We got that glitch at the start when it wraps round. So that hopefully will sound a bit better. If I tweak the release, so you can see what that's doing. It's sort of mellowing out the sound. It's almost made that interruption, you know, less detectable, smeared it out a bit. If I make it the intervals shorter, I'm not convinced that's the best sound actually. Let's see if we can get a different sound in. I think that's a previous iteration of my hum, so we'll take that one. Yeah, so there you go. And I can play with the, if I reduce the sustain and put a bit of decay on, well, that's subtle. You're not necessarily going to hear that. So that's the first thing we can do. And let me just tweak a couple of other things. That attack, decay and release are by default linear. If you look at the button, if we take the attack as an example, to the right there's a button that says lin. If we click that, we get an exponential attack. Let me just tweak that. So that drops off much quicker. Or it's, yeah, you know what I mean. Logarithmic. And then back to linear. So logarithmic and exponential are opposites in a sense. And we've got the same on the decay slider and on the release slider. On the sustain slider, we've got something a little bit different. It says sus, then it says SGL, then it says psych. Now that's very interesting. Essentially, if you change that to anything other than sustain, we no longer have an ADSR envelope, we have an ADR envelope. Now that changes the game because we no longer have a fixed length envelope. Changing the decay essentially changes the pulse width. I think I'm right in saying that. So we should be able to detect that. So if I change that button, that sustain button, to say SGL, that stands for single, it fires the envelope once on each step, which is the same as it does on the with sustain at sustain. But instead of an ADSR envelope, we get an ADR envelope, and we can vary the length of that by changing the decay, I think. How can I illustrate this? If I make the pulse, what I've done is I've set the length to greater than quarter of a second, and then we should be able to tweak the decay and still get that interruption. So in a sense, the pulse width that we're setting by setting the ADR, that is doing the same job as the length slider, and in a sense it overrides the length slider. Even though we've got a long step, the ADR envelope is clipping that step. The other button, so the other value of that sustain button is CYC, and that stands for cyclic. That, instead of triggering the ADR envelope once per step, it will trigger it repeatedly until the step is complete. So if we've got a step set to a length of currently 1 second, in fact let's set it to a quarter of a second just so we're not too confused. So the quarter of a second step, remember that's just undetectable, it doesn't chop, it's exactly the same length as the step. But if we set the ADR envelope to be shorter than that, it will play the or trigger the envelope over and over again until the step is complete. So if that's set to a very long value, we won't hear any interruption. If it's set to a very short value, we'll hear multiple interruptions per step. So what does that sound like? It's just interrupting there. But if I make that shorter, this is the envelope going shorter. I wonder if that's being interfered with because the attack and release is so long. Let me change the attack and release to be very short and try that again. So, okay, just to remind you, I'm changing the length of the ADR envelope, and we should hear that repeating. We'll get it triggered as many times as it's necessary to fill that quarter second step. You can hear. And if I make the attack and release 0, that's interesting. When I make the attack and release 0, we're not able to hear that interruption. I wonder, there's probably some subtlety I'm missing there. We'll make them very small but present. That's almost a ring modulation. And that's interesting as well. So I've got attack 0, decay 0, and changing the release gives me a different effect again. And that's interesting. We're getting a kind of a irregular rhythm there. It's sort of regularly irregular, if you like. I suspect what's happening there is the cycle that's going on to trigger that pulse. To trigger that envelope over and over again during each step is in some sense beating with something to do with the frequency of this hum, I think. So we're getting this kind of irregular, stumbling kind of effect. It's like a swing beat. Let's just see what that sounds like with the different so you can see that's interesting already. And what we can do is, just while we've got this sound loaded, we can try changing the sequence. In fact, let's speed it up. We'll go at twice the BPM and we'll turn off a few steps. Essentially, you've got to think about this as, on every step of the sequence, the envelope gets triggered and it applies a gate to the playback over and over again. And you're just playing with the parameters of that, you know, making the gate softer or harder, longer or shorter. A couple of other things that you can do with that: if you press the button labelled BEG, every time the envelope triggers, it resets to the start of the sample. Is that right? Let's try that. Well, it's certainly playing the same part of the sample. I think that's what that means. The other button, DLY, that stands for delay. That's something to do with the delay effects. By default, this envelope is applied right at the end of the processing. So all the mangling's gone on, and then it applies the envelope gate to chop up the output sequence. Now, if you've got a delay effect, that doesn't really make sense, because you're going to lose the delay by chopping it up. So what this does is, if you click that button on, if you have a delay effect as part of your effects setup, it does the chopping up with the envelope generator before the delay is applied. So you preserve that delay, the integrity of that effect. Let's see if we can hear that. I'll toggle it on. Switching it on now. Alright, well, on this particular sample we don't really seem to be getting much. That's because we don't have a delay on. Let's put a delay on this. Oh, goodness me. If I go back into the sequencer, disable that, unmute that, we'll set a delay. Let's see. So that should be a very very noticeable delay. Go back into the sequencer, re-enable that envelope generator. So that's the default setting, and you should get that the entire output is being chopped up. So there are, if you looked at a waveform of this, you'd actually see pauses, gaps. But if we click the delay on, moving the envelope generator further upstream, those gaps will disappear. We'll have those gaps So we wouldn't see those gaps in the output because the delay is being applied later. I'm still just playing around with the same thing. I'm playing with that ADR envelope again. I'm just manipulating the release, and if I put the delay button back on, I quite like that already. So that's the envelope generator, and you should already see that gives you quite a lot of extra flexibility for manipulating your output in some quite bizarre and interesting ways. Let me see, should I go back to a rhythmic sample? Let us do that. I'll go with that one again. I'm going to press reset. So everything's back to default. So if we just put these all back on, and then we'll just tinker briefly with the rhythm. Not doing anything clever with the gate. So the gate's basically a square wave again. Let's make this faster. I'm confused now why I'm not hearing any interruption. Oh, I haven't got it enabled, that's why. Okay, so we've got it at 4 times BPM, so it's going pretty fast. And if we just tinker with some of the so you see we can get some rhythm in there as well. Alright, so that's enough of that. That's the envelope generator. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the other thing the step sequencer can do. This is something it can do in parallel with, or actually technically in series with the envelope generator. But you can run the two in combination is what I mean to say, or in fact you can run them independently. But I'm going to, if I make sure we've reset the sequence, what do I need to do? Let me load up a different sound for this. Yeah, we'll load this one up. So we're on the empty preset. This is something I've recorded, just some mandolin kind of sounds. So if we go into the sequencer and we mute that for now, what we look at now is how to use the step sequencer to tweak or animate one of the parameters of one of the effects. And the way we do that is we're going to use basically stay on the top half of this dialog for now. We still have the BPM modifiers and the facility to turn on and off the steps of the sequence. That all works the same. The step length works the same, but everything below that we're going to ignore that. Everything above that is relevant to the present discussion. So we've got another enable button at the top left there, which I'm just toggling on and off. We'll leave it off for now. Next to that, and that's next to a legend that says param, so that stands for parameter. And the parameters we can select are selected by clicking on that button that currently says os clock. That stands for oscillator clock. Now I forgot to mention this earlier, but we've got 3 independent sequences here, one for each oscillator. So as before, we're sticking with oscillator 1 for this demo. Now, it would be nice if there was a drop-down menu or something to see what parameters are available and to select them from a list. You can't do that. You just have to cycle through them. So we've got clock offset. I'll just read them out. Mask selector, mask shifter, distortion value, depth, filter frequency resonance, delay, time on feedback, mixer distance, and panorama. And we're back. So let's choose the one that's going to be obvious. We'll choose the, well, a clock. This is a confusing one. I've got a feeling that clock, let's just experiment with this. The clock controls the playback speed, and it's normally available under the Oscillator tab. Here it is. So we've got clock, and we go, if I just unmute that, we can slow it down. And if we click the fast button, that same slider speeds you up. So what happens? Let's imagine we're going to use the clock parameter to tweak. We've got 16 steps active. In fact, let's simplify this. We'll make it 4 steps active. So if I click on there, click step, as before, that little red line underneath the bottom shortens, and we're cycling through 4 steps there. We'll turn 3 of them off, again, just for purposes of illustration. And on the first one, if you click and drag on that column, you'll notice that it's actually a slider. Now, another way to do that is, click on the column, and the slider is actually mirrored in that long left to right slider below. So you can tweak that. That's actually easier to adjust more finely. But if we just put that slider to the left and then let that run, well, we have to click the enable button. Now what you notice is when that slider is moved to the left to a negative value, it's not actually having any effect. And that's because if we go back to the, I think this is because, if we go back to where that clock is in the oscillator dialog, the way that slider works is we're either tweaking, it's 2 separate parameters really, which we have to choose which one we're working on. We're either working on clock divide, which is the default, which means that anything we do to that slider makes it go slower or less slow, if you like. Not slower or less slower. More slower or less slower. I know what I mean, hopefully you do. So we can't make the sound speed up by tweaking that slider. But if we click fast on, we've got the opposite. We can make the sound go faster by a greater or lesser degree. So if we go back to sequencer, we should predict that moving that slider into the positive range will begin to slow down the playback when it's triggered by that step of the sequence. There he goes. And because that's the only step of the sequence that interferes with, in fact that's the only animation of that parameter that we have running at all, it basically stays there for the whole sequence. It doesn't vary. The first time it's set, it varies, then after that it remains as it is. But if we go to the, let's say, the 3rd step in that sequence, and we set a different value, which is, let's say, a much higher value, it should slow down more, and then when it recycles to the 1st step, it should reduce that parameter, and so the amount of slowdown reduces. This is hopelessly back to front, but you should hear that. We'll just let it play for a while so it gets to a... So you can hear that. If I exaggerate that even more, well, that's probably going out of the audible range there. If we put a few more steps in, we change a few more. So you can hear that clock speed is varying, hopefully you can. And if we just leave that running but go back into the oscillator and click the fast button, we should predict that that will be a speed up instead of a slowdown. And indeed it is. If we go back in there and we select a different parameter, we'll select the clock offset, because the clock offset actually does work in a more intuitive way. We have the clock set, let's just set this up in the oscillator to 1.0. It's playback at full speed. If we were to wiggle this clock offset slider, we can either slow down or speed up by kind of fine tuning. So that's the parameter we're going to tweak next. If we click on where it says OSC clock, it flips to clock offset. So we're now manipulating the clock offset. So those negative ranges should work as expected. So if we go and make a couple of steps increase the range, a couple of steps decrease the clock speed offset, we should hear the pitch going up and down on that cycle. Let's give it a whirl. I think you can hear that. Let's exaggerate that by making them much more obvious. And if we enable the other steps, should we do that? No, we won't do that. We speed that up by multiplying the BPM, so we're doubling the speed, quadruple the speed. And what I was doing now is just tweaking the length parameter. I think I'm right in saying the length parameter has no significance if we're not, it only has significance to the envelope generator, to that gate function. So remember, it's kind of a gate length, if you like. The important thing for modifying the parameters is at the start of that, you know, each step is a sort of one-shot trigger, if you like. So at the start of that step, the parameter is changed, and it just remains changed until another step changes it to a different value. So the the step length doesn't have any effect. But of course, if you have the envelope generator running in parallel, you get a different effect again. You get both of those things happening at the same time. It's a very unhelpful demonstration of that, actually. So what else can you vary other than the clock? I mean, the clock speed arguably isn't a particularly helpful one to vary. We're going to, don't forget, we've got the empty preset on this, so we've just got these mandolin sounds playing. Let's put some delay on that. Yeah, maybe that's quite a good demonstration. Go back into the sequencer. If we change that parameter to, we just keep clicking on it until we get the, I keep saying filter instead of delay. Delay. Delay time. Let's not use the delay time because that could be quite subtle. Let's use the delay feedback. So that's the number of repeats that we get on the delay. And if we leave those parameters as we've set them, we should get some wild variation in the delay timing. Let's see. And then we have to click enable. That's doing something. Again, I'm just tweaking that length slider to demonstrate that it doesn't seem to have any influence. But that's kind of a nice effect. Let's make that sequence full length again, and we'll put some more of these things in. Let's just see how that sounds. We'll enable them all. Whoops, that's disabling them all. There we go. Maybe we'll choose a different, let's choose a different preset for this. We'll choose one of the built-in presets. This is a good way to learn about this is to look at some of the built-in presets. There's actually quite a few presets that have the word sequence in them, so you can pick them out and experiment with them. Because generally they do something slightly more coherent than me just poking at the buttons and making it up as I go along. Let's try this one. Hear how this sounds. So that's the same sound sample, but that's got a nice rhythmic quality to it. That's using the envelope generator to give us that sort of beat. It's got a delay built in, and we've got the delay option selected so the envelope generator doesn't interfere with it, and actually the parameter tweaker is targeting the delay feedback. So if we just, when I enable that, see if we can detect a difference. I think what works, I mean, certainly changes the sound to my ear, but you know what's really helpful for this is to load in, well, either your own samples or things you're familiar with, or record just bits of your voice and things and play with it that way, and that's a good way to experiment. Now, another useful tip is, let's imagine we were trying to tweak those individual parameters. You know, you can do it just by fiddling with them. Let's just have a go at that. I'll just move these up and down. You know, it's all very haphazard, doing it ad hoc like that. There is a useful feature, which is there's a button to the right of the enable button called hold, HLD hold. If you click that on while a particular step is selected, actually that's not an active step, let's choose an active step, which is the first one. Let's not choose the first one because that's confusing. Let's choose that one and click hold and play it. Well, you may or may not detect, we're not actually getting any variation because although the sequence is playing, it's not triggering all the steps, it's only triggering that selected step every time. If I click that off, hopefully you can hear we're getting much more variation. If I click it back on and there's a red flash to denote that that one is held, that's allowing us to tweak that particular parameter and actually hear what it's doing. In fact, if I select, I went past it. If I select clock offset, that should be more obvious. So that step is held. You can see that as the playhead goes by there and triggers that step, it changes to the new version of the parameter. Again, just to point out something that might be counterintuitive here, when I move the slider to the right into the positive range, it's actually reducing the playback speed, and if I move it into the negative range to the left, it's increasing the playback speed. That's because we've got the clock selected to slow, so we're increasing the slowness or decreasing it. We're increasing the slowdown or decreasing the slowdown. If that was set to fast, that slider works more intuitively. That's just in passing. So that's what the hold. I think I'm going to go back to my hum. Take that one. Right. And we put it on clock. We put it on fast. Right. So back to the sequencer. We're going to set the value of that parameter to raise the clock offset. So we're still demonstrating the hold function. If I pick another one, enable that step, hold that step, set that to a low parameter. It's the effect of that held parameter that we're hearing. If I click back to this one, that's the one we're hearing. In fact, if you leave the held button enabled and just toggle between the steps, that determines which one you're hearing. I hope that made some kind of sense. In fact, we'll do another demo because this is, in fact, many of the samples use the mask shifter and the mask selector. Now, oh God, if you're not familiar with Fieldscaper, this may or may not make sense. I'll just make one attempt to demonstrate this. If I go back with my musical sample and we go back to the empty preset, let's listen to that. Unmute it. So that's just playing that piece of music through. Going to sequence, and we're going to leave off the envelope generator, but we're going to select, in fact, before we go into sequence, let's go into the oscillator setup. We want to select address, enable, and we'll leave it at set 1 for now, and we're going to select a mask, which is a kind of mangling mask. I need to unmute this. So this is the, if you've been following along and watched my other video on Fieldscaper, or indeed Soundscaper, which has the same function built in but with a different wrapper, this is the thing that interferes with the retrieval of the sample data by stamping on the address lines, or the notional address lines. And so we've set that up, and then what we can do is, if we go into the sequencer and we select the mask shifter as the parameter we're going to play with. If we, let me see, let's have a 4-step sequence again, and we'll enable the first one, and let's just see what that sounds like out of the gate. If we vary the value, and if we vary again to a different value on the 3rd step, okay, it's not doing anything because I haven't enabled it. That's more like it. So you can clearly hear that something's changing on each of those steps. If we go to the first one and hold it, we can vary that till we get something we like. We kind of like that. We go to this one, kind of like that as well. So if we unhold, and we can see what that's doing. If we go back into the oscillator, we can actually see that mask shift changing. You can see the mask itself in the middle of the screen, those yellow flashes. You can see the underneath the mask shifter slider, you can see that little red bar shifting to show the two different positions of that slider. Let's see, can we do anything more with that to make it slightly more interesting? If we make it a 16-step sequence, let's just randomly fiddle with some of these. Oh god, this is probably going to sound like a dog's breakfast. Let's see how that goes. Okay, not a very convincing demo. I suppose the last thing we can do is we can try out some of the presets on this sound. This is, so here's one, echoes after sound. That's quite a slow sequence, obviously. That's a 4-step sequence working on the mask shifter. So if we go and look at that live, it's changing the mask. It's doing it very slowly, and you can see it's achieved that by, what do we have set? We're still on 60 BPM, but we're dividing by 8. Down here we can change that, speed that up a bit. We've got the envelope generator active as well. If we take the envelope generator off, I mean, this is a good illustration of one particular use for the envelope generator. You know, this is a very slow sequence. We're dividing the BPM by 8, which gives us a very slow step. We've got an envelope which is 1/4 of a second long, so we're getting 1/4 second pulses, but with a big gap between them. So we're getting that sort of intermittent, sporadic sound, which is quite different to the source material, which I can toggle between them. So that's more or less the source, with some of that mask shifting going on with the address mangling. That's the chopped up version. You know, we're getting into the territory almost of granular synthesis. I mean, it's not granular, but it's taking slices of that music really out of context and applying, you know, distortion and effects to them, and we're getting a quite different resulting sound. So that's that particular preset. And we choose a different one, flickering oscillations. So that's more of a rhythmic, you know, that previous one was too slow really to count as rhythmic. This one is rhythmic. This is BPM times 4, and we've got 16 steps active, and we're tweaking the clock speed. And you know, you can go into this and tweak things. If I change the clock tweaking to fast instead of slow, doesn't sound great. Let's choose another one. Oh, this is another quite sporadic one, so we're going to find it's got a low clock. It's got a clock divided by 4, and it's also got you know, some further division in the rhythm, if you like, by not all the steps are selected. And the parameter tweaking is tweaking the delay time. So there's a delay set, and it's tweaking the delay time up and down fairly subtly, has to be said. and we do have the envelope generator. So again, we've got that. If I toggle envelope on and off, we lose that sporadic sound and we get back to the kind of musical sound, although it's not as continuous because we've got some gaps in which steps are triggered. That's another one. See if there's more. Rhythmic step. That one's kind of dull. That's a 4-step sequence. Again, tweaking the mask shifter. So that's that one. What else we have? That one's obviously got some major delay. Yeah. And we're tweaking the delay feedback. So there you go, that's pretty much all we need to say about the sequencer, I think. I'm sure somebody will let me know if I've left anything out. But all in all, it's a, you know, I think it's a great addition to Fieldscaper. It's something really interesting to tweak and to play with, but it helps to understand what you're tweaking. You know, it's not the most obvious or intuitive thing to do. The one thing I haven't done is, you know, the reason that we pay attention to all this BPM and time signatures is you can sync this up with other audio apps. In a sense, it makes, you know, it begins to make sense to do that with Fieldscaper. I mean, let me see, should I try that? Let's find a nice one. Let's take this sequence, which is a tweaked one. So that's kind of rhythmical. I'm going to go to, now this may not work, so I may edit this all out. I'm going to change from internal BPM to Ableton link. I'm going to go and run up AUM. I'm going to load in Fieldscaper. I'm also going to load in, not really into all these drum machines and so on, but so I'll go in there. I think I've got Ableton on for this guy. Sync, Ableton is enabled. That's just a rhythm I happen to have lying around. Let's see if we can. You should hear that synchronizing. Okay, it's not the most inspiring or the most musical composition you're going to hear all day. Hopefully it gives you an idea that this can be done. Igor's actually done a demo of his own showing him syncing some slightly more coherent stuff with an external drum machine, so go and check that out. So there you go, that's the step sequencer in Fieldscaper. Hopefully that will give you some inspiration to try your own experiments.